The Crimson Star Diner had seen better days. Hell, it had seen better decades. The neon sign outside flickered more than it glowed, and half the booths had duct tape holding the vinyl seats together. But it was home to Katie Brooks, and on nights like this, when the station was quiet and the stars looked cold through the viewport, she didn't mind the solitude. She wiped down the counter for the third time that hour. The rag made squeaking sounds against the faux marble surface. Her shift had another 4 hours to go, and so far she'd served exactly 2 customers. A Velian trader who'd nursed a single coffee for an hour, and a maintenance worker who'd grabbed a sandwich to go. Katie glanced at the old Earth clock on the wall. Her mom had given it to her before she'd left for the outer stations. It still kept Earth time, even though Earth was 6 months of travel away. The second hand ticked forward with a soft click-click-click that usually comforted her. Tonight, it just reminded her how slowly time moved when you were alone. The doors hissed open. Katie looked up, expecting maybe another late-night trucker or a drunk looking for coffee. What she got instead made her hand freeze mid-wipe. 12 giants filled the doorway. They had to duck to enter, each one standing at least 10 feet tall. Their bodies were covered in scales, midnight black scales that caught the diner's fluorescent lights and threw them back like polished stone. Heavy armor plating covered their chests and shoulders, etched with symbols Katie didn't recognize but somehow knew meant danger. Their eyes glowed amber, like coals in a fire, scanning the room with the precision of trained killers. The Saurian Empire's Royal Guard. Katie's heart hammered against her ribs. Everyone in the galaxy knew about the Saurians. They were the stories parents told their kids to make them behave. The empire that had conquered 17 civilizations in the last century alone. Warriors who'd never lost a major battle. Their soldiers could tear through steel with their bare claws, and their war fleets could glass a planet in hours. And 12 of them had just walked into her diner. Behind the guards came another figure. He was taller than the rest, his scales a deeper black that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. But unlike the guards, his armor bore crimson markings, royal colors. Katie had seen enough news broadcasts to recognize what that meant. Prince Thalmor, heir to Emperor Drakvan the Unconquered, the future ruler of the largest empire in known space. One of the guards barked something in their language, a series of guttural sounds that made Katie's teeth hurt. She didn't need a translator to understand the tone. They wanted service and they wanted it now. Katie forced her legs to move. "Welcome to Crimson Star," she said, proud that her voice didn't shake. "Right this way." She led them to the corner booth, the biggest one they had, though even that looked comically small for the prince's massive frame. The guards positioned themselves around the diner with military precision, 2 by the door, 2 by the kitchen entrance, the rest scattered to cover all angles of attack. The prince sat down stiffly, his back ramrod straight. His head nearly touched the ceiling. Katie noticed something odd about his scales. They should have been the deep crimson of royalty, but instead they flickered between crimson and muted gray, like a mood ring stuck between settings. She'd heard that Saurian scales changed color with emotion. Gray meant distress. The guards rattled off orders in their language. Katie caught the word for expensive, and nodded, making notes on her pad even though she understood maybe 1 word in 10. She'd figure it out. When she approached the prince to take his order, he didn't look at her. His eyes fixed on some point in the distance, his jaw clenched tight. Up close she could see the scars that crisscrossed his scales, burn marks, claw rakes, what looked like plasma scoring. He couldn't have been more than 60 cycles old, which for Saurians meant he was barely an adult. But he'd already been through hell. "And for you, sir?" Katie asked. "Nothing," the prince said quietly. His voice was deep, rumbling like distant thunder, but there was something hollow in it. Katie nodded and headed to the kitchen. She put together the guard's order, the most expensive items on the menu, mostly meat dishes and protein supplements. The kind of meal that would cost a week's wages for a station worker. She brought everything out on a hovering tray. The guards ate like they did everything else, efficiently and without enjoyment. They were refueling, not dining. But the prince didn't touch his food. The guards had ordered for him, some kind of rare steak that cost more than Katie made in a month. It sat in front of him, untouched and cooling. His clawed hands rested on the table, and Katie noticed they were trembling. Just slightly but definitely trembling. She brought water, plain earth water, nothing fancy. As she set the glass down in front of him, she saw it. The prince's hand moved quickly, almost too fast to see, wiping at his eyes with the back of his claw. Katie's chest tightened. She'd worked this diner long enough to recognize pain when she saw it. Hours crawled by. The few other patrons who'd been scattered around the diner took one look at the Saurian Royal Guard and decided they needed to be somewhere else. Katie couldn't blame them. The guards radiated menace like a heater radiated warmth. Around midnight, the captain of the guard said something sharp. The guards stood as one unit and filed toward the door. Perimeter check, Katie guessed, making sure no threats were lurking outside. Their heavy footsteps faded down the corridor. The diner fell silent except for the hum of the refrigeration units and that damn clock ticking on the wall. That's when it happened. The prince's shoulders began to shake. His head dropped forward into his massive claws. And Katie watched, frozen behind the counter, as tears, actual tears, began dripping onto the table. The most feared warrior race in the galaxy. And their prince was crying alone in her diner. Every cell in Katie's body screamed at her to stay behind that counter. To mind her own business. To let the prince cry in peace and pretend she hadn't seen anything. She'd heard the stories. Saurian honor codes were brutal and absolute. Witnessing an Imperial family member in a moment of weakness was a death sentence. The guards would snap her neck before she could blink. They'd call it mercy, a quick death instead of the slow, ritualistic execution reserved for serious offenses against the crown. Katie's hand gripped the edge of the counter. Her knuckles went white. But then she looked at him again. This massive alien prince, shoulders shaking, trying so hard to muffle his sobs so no one would hear. And all Katie could see was every broken person who'd ever sat in this diner at 3 a.m, drowning in loneliness and pain. She'd served coffee to the widow who'd lost her husband in a mining accident. To the kid who'd been kicked out by his parents for being different. To the old man whose children never called anymore. Pain was pain. It didn't matter if you had scales or skin, 2 legs or 4. Katie grabbed 2 clean mugs and poured fresh coffee into both. Her hands were steady now. She'd made her decision. She walked over to the booth and slid into the seat across from him. "Hey," she said softly, pushing one mug toward him. "Rough day?" Thalmore's head snapped up so fast Katie heard his neck vertebrae crack. His amber eyes went wide, not with anger but with pure shock. For a second neither of them moved. Then his scales exploded into brilliant crimson. Every scale on his body flared bright red, a threat display that usually preceded violence. His lips pulled back, showing rows of razor-sharp teeth designed to tear through armor plating. Katie didn't flinch. She'd seen enough bar fights and drunken threats to know the difference between someone who wanted to hurt you and someone who was just scared. She met his eyes with calm concern, her hands wrapped around her coffee mug. The crimson flickered, faded, shifted to confused gray. "You." Thalmore's voice came out rough, like he hadn't used it properly in days. "You dare sit with me? Do you not understand what I am?" "You're someone having a bad night," Katie said simply. "I'm Katie, by the way. What's your name? Your real name, I mean. Not the fancy titles." She watched something crack in his expression. Maybe it was exhaustion. He looked like he hadn't slept in weeks. Maybe it was the shock of this tiny human treating him like a person instead of a living weapon. Or maybe it was just that someone had finally asked him a question that had nothing to do with duty or conquest or living up to impossible standards. "Thalmore," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Nice to meet you, Thalmore." Katie pushed the water glass closer to him. "You want to talk about it? Whatever's got you this upset?" She half expected him to tell her to leave. To threaten her. To call his guards back and have her removed. Instead, something inside him seemed to break wide open. The words came pouring out. He told her about the rite of ascension, this insane ceremony where he'd have to single-handedly conquer 3 inhabited star systems. Not just defeat their militaries but completely subjugate them. Billions of lives hanging in the balance, and he'd have to be the one to crush them. If he succeeded, he'd be worthy of the throne. If he failed, he'd bring shame to 1,000 generations of ancestors. He talked about his father, Emperor Drakvan. How the old warrior looked at him with cold disappointment every time Thalmore hesitated before ordering an execution. How his father had once told him that mercy was a disease that needed to be burned out. "I can hear them," Thalmore said, his voice cracking. "All the emperors who came before me. Their victories, their conquests, their absolute ruthlessness. I'm supposed to be like them. Better than them. But I'm not. I'm weak. I'm broken. I don't want to conquer worlds, I just want." He trailed off, fresh tears spilling down his scaled cheeks. Katie listened to all of it. She didn't interrupt with advice or platitudes. She just listened, occasionally reaching over to refill his water, letting him pour out decades of pressure and pain. Her mom had taught her that sometimes the best thing you could do for someone was just be present. Just witness their pain without trying to fix it. When he finally fell silent, exhausted from talking, Katie asked quietly, "When's the last time someone asked how you were feeling?" Thalmore stared at her like she'd just spoken in an alien language. His mouth opened, closed. His brow furrowed as he actually tried to remember. Never, he finally said, the word heavy with realization. Feelings are irrelevant. That's what we're taught from the moment we hatch. Emotions are weakness. A warrior thinks with his mind, not his heart. We're trained to suppress everything. To be perfect killing machines. That's bullshit, Katie said gently. The prince blinked at her. No, I'm serious. That's complete bullshit. Katie leaned forward, her voice firm but kind. Feelings aren't weakness, Thalmor. They're part of being alive. Every living thing feels fear, joy, sadness, love. Trying to cut that out of yourself doesn't make you strong. It just makes you hollow. She reached across the table and tapped his chest plate lightly. You're exhausted. You're terrified of failing. You're crushed under expectations no one should have to carry. And you know what? That's okay. That's completely normal. That's not weakness, that's being honest about what you're going through. Fresh tears spilled down Thalmor's scaled cheeks. But this time he didn't try to hide them. Katie did something that should have gotten her killed. She reached across the table and placed her small human hand over his massive claw. The moment her skin made contact with his scales, Thalmor went absolutely rigid. His entire body locked up like someone had hit a pause button. Katie felt the texture of his scales under her palm, smooth and cool, like river stones that had been sitting in shade. His claws were easily 3 times the length of her fingers, curved and sharp enough to slice through steel. One twitch and he could tear her arm off. But Katie didn't pull away. She just let her hand rest there warm and steady. Thalmor stared down at their hands like he was seeing something impossible. His breathing had gone shallow. In Saurian culture, physical contact with royalty without explicit permission was a capital offense. People had been executed for less. For accidentally brushing against an imperial guard's armor. For standing too close to a royal transport. And here was this human, this tiny fragile creature, touching him like it was the most natural thing in the world. But what stunned him more than the audacity was the feeling itself. Her hand was warm, gentle. There was no calculation in the gesture, no attempt to manipulate or control. Just simple human compassion offered freely. Thalmor realized with a clarity that hit him like a physical blow. No one had ever touched him with kindness before. Not once in 60 years of life. You know what I think? Katie said softly, her thumb moving in small circles against his scales. I think you're carrying a weight no one should have to carry alone. And I think. She paused, her brown eyes searching his amber ones. I think you just want someone to tell you it's okay to be scared. That you're enough exactly as you are. Thalmor's breath caught in his throat. He tried to speak but couldn't. The words were there, somewhere deep inside, but they wouldn't come out. Katie squeezed his claw gently. My mom used to say that the bravest thing you can do is admit when you need help. That asking for comfort doesn't make you weak, it makes you honest. It makes you. She smiled slightly. Well, she said it makes you human. But I think you know what I mean. Your mother, Thalmor managed, his voice barely above a whisper. She sounds wise. She was. Katie's smile turned sad, her eyes getting that distant look people get when they're remembering someone they've lost. Diane Brooks. Toughest woman I ever knew. She was a nurse back on Earth, worked in the emergency room for 30 years. Saw every kind of trauma you can imagine, but she never got hard. Never stopped caring. Katie looked down at their hands, hers so small against his. She got sick 5 years ago. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. The doctors gave her 6 months. She lasted 8, fighting every single day. Her voice got thick. I was with her at the end. Holding her hand just like this. And you know what her last words to me were? Thalmor shook his head slightly. She said, Katie, don't waste your life running from pain. Find someone who needs kindness and give it to them. So I came out here to the outer stations. As far from Earth as I could get. Thought I was running away from my grief. She laughed, but it was sad. Turns out I was running toward exactly what she wanted me to find. A place where I could help people who were hurting. You tend to the wounded, Thalmor said slowly, understanding dawning. You are a healer of souls. I wouldn't go that far. Katie shook her head. I just serve coffee and listen. But sometimes. She squeezed his claw again. Sometimes that's what people need most. Someone who'll just sit with them in their pain. Who won't try to fix them or tell them to be stronger. Just someone who sees them and cares. Thalmor felt something crack deep inside his chest. A wall he'd spent his entire life building, stone by stone, crumbling under the weight of simple human compassion. The sound of heavy footsteps echoed down the corridor. The guards were returning from their perimeter check. They entered the diner in formation, their amber eyes immediately scanning for threats. What they saw made every single one of them freeze. Their prince, the heir to the Saurian throne, sitting with tears streaming down his face. And a common human waitress, touching him. Her hand on his claw like she had every right to be there. 12 weapons cleared their holsters in perfect synchronization. Plasma rifles hummed to life, targeting lasers painting red dots across Katie's chest. But Katie didn't flinch. She looked up at the guards calmly, her hand still resting on Thalmor's claw. Thalmor raised his free claw, a sharp, commanding gesture. "Leave us," he said, his voice carrying the weight of imperial authority despite the tears on his face. "That is an order." The captain of the guard stepped forward, his weapon still raised. "Your Highness, protocol demands." "I am aware of protocol," Thalmor cut him off, his scales flashing with authoritative crimson. "And I am ordering you to give me privacy. Now." The guards exchanged glances. This violated every rule in their training manual. But a direct order from the prince couldn't be ignored. Slowly, reluctantly, they lowered their weapons. The captain gestured sharply and the guards filed back outside. But as he turned, Katie caught the subtle movement of his hand, fingers brushing against his wrist device. A recording implant, standard issue for royal guards. He was documenting everything. Katie filed that information away but didn't mention it. Right now, the prince needed her more than she needed to worry about galactic consequences. When the footsteps faded and they were alone again, Katie looked back at Thalmor. His scales had returned to that muted gray, the color of deep sadness. She took a breath and asked the question that had been forming in her mind. The question that might explain everything. "Thalmor, do you remember your mother?" The prince went absolutely still. The color drained from his scales entirely, leaving them almost translucent. His amber eyes went wide, pupils contracting to pinpoints. His breathing stopped. And Katie knew with terrible certainty that she'd just touched on something far deeper than she'd imagined. The silence stretched for what felt like forever. Katie watched Thalmor's face, watched the way his scales had gone almost completely transparent, like all the color had been drained from his body. His jaw worked like he was trying to form words but nothing came out. Finally, in a voice so quiet Katie had to lean forward to hear it, he whispered, "No." That single word carried more pain than Katie had heard in her entire life. "Saurian emperors are never raised by birth parents," Thalmor said, each word seeming to cost him something. "The moment we hatch from our eggs, we're taken away. Removed from the breeding chambers before we can even see who laid the egg. Before we can hear a voice, feel a touch, know anything except cold metal and artificial light." Katie's chest tightened. "They put us in isolation chambers," he continued, his voice hollow. "Individual cells designed for hatchlings. Combat masters come to train us. Protocol instructors teach us 17 languages and the proper way to stand, speak, kill. But we never see our parents. We're never told who they are. The Empire says it's necessary. That emotional attachments make weak leaders. That we must be forged into perfect weapons, unburdened by sentiment." His claws dug into the table, leaving deep grooves in the synthetic wood. "I was 3 cycles old when I first asked about my mother. The instructor hit me so hard I couldn't hear properly for a week. He said questions like that were forbidden. That I had no mother. That I was born from the Empire itself, a child of conquest and glory." "Oh God," Katie breathed. "I never asked again," Thalmor said. "But I never stopped wondering. Late at night, when the training was done and I was alone in my chambers, I'd lie awake and try to imagine what she looked like. Whether her scales were crimson like mine should be. Whether she had a kind voice. Whether she ever thought about the egg she'd laid and would never see hatch." His voice cracked and fresh tears spilled down his face. "I used to press my claws against my chest, right here, because there was this ache. This hollow feeling like something vital had been carved out of me. And I didn't understand what it was. I just knew it hurt." Katie's own tears were falling now, hot tracks down her cheeks. "The palace physicians have a name for it," Thalmor continued, his words coming faster now, like a dam that had finally burst. "They call it void syndrome. A psychological condition that affects approximately 40% of imperially raised Saurians. They say it's a weakness in our genetic line. A flaw that needs to be medicated and suppressed." He laughed, but it was a bitter, broken sound. "They gave me pills. Injections. Neurological treatments. Anything to make the ache stop. But it never did. It just got worse as I got older. Especially when I'd see other species, humans, Velians, even the Corthans, with their families. I'd watch parents hold their children, and I couldn't even understand what I was feeling. just this overwhelming emptiness. It's not a weakness, Katie said fiercely, her voice shaking with emotion. Thalmor, that's one of the most fundamental needs any living being can have. Connection. Well, comfort. Your people didn't breed it out of you, they just tried to bury it. But it's still there because it's supposed to be there. Love. Thalmor repeated the word slowly, like he was tasting something foreign. I know the word. I've read it in human literature, heard it in your songs. But I don't understand it. We don't have a word for it in our language. The closest translation is strategic alliance. Love is. Katie searched for the right words. It's caring about someone else's happiness as much as your own. It's wanting to protect them, comfort them, be there for them even when it's hard. It's what parents feel for their children. What my mom felt for me. She squeezed his claw tighter. Sweetheart, you don't want to conquer star systems. That's not what this emptiness is about. You just want someone to hold you and tell you everything's going to be okay. You want what was stolen from you. You want a mother. The word hit Thalmor like a physical blow. His entire body jerked. His scales flashed through every color, crimson, gray, even deep blue that Katie had never seen before. And then he collapsed forward, his massive frame folding in on itself. Sobs tore from his throat, deep, wrenching sounds that seemed to come from somewhere ancient and primal. His shoulders shook violently. His claws scraped against the table, against his own face, like he didn't know what to do with the overwhelming emotion flooding through him. Katie didn't think. She just moved. She slid out of her seat and came around to his side of the booth. This enormous alien prince, this creature who could tear her apart without effort, was breaking down completely. And all Katie could see was someone who desperately needed what her mother had always given her, unconditional comfort. She wrapped her arms around him as far as they would go, which wasn't very far given his size. Her head barely reached his chest. But she held him anyway, one hand rubbing small circles on his scaled back, the other cradling the back of his head. It's okay, she murmured, her voice soft and steady despite her own tears. You're safe. I've got you. It's okay to cry. Let it all out. You've been holding this in for too long. Thalmor's arms came up slowly, hesitantly, like he didn't know if he was allowed to return the embrace. Then they wrapped around her, carefully, so carefully, and he held on like she was the only solid thing in a universe that was falling apart. And he wept. 60 years of suppressed grief, loneliness, and longing poured out of him in waves. Outside, hidden in the shadows near the doorway, the captain of the guard stood with his hand on his wrist device. The recording implant captured every word, every sob, every moment of forbidden vulnerability. The footage was already uploading to the Imperial network. By dawn, the footage had already spread across the entire Imperial network. Katie had no idea. She'd sent Thalmor off with the guards around 3 in the morning, watched them disappear down the station corridors and then closed up the diner. She'd gone back to her tiny apartment, fallen into bed exhausted, and slept dreamlessly for the first time in months. She woke up to her comm device exploding with notifications. At first she thought it was a malfunction. 3,000 messages couldn't be real. But when she opened the feed, her blood went cold. The footage was everywhere. Someone had edited it into a 10-minute clip. Thalmor crying, Katie's hand on his claw, their entire conversation about mothers and love and void syndrome. The moment she'd held him while he sobbed. All of it crystal clear, high definition, impossible to deny. The title read, The Prince Who Wept, What the Empire Doesn't Want You to See. By midday it was on every news feed in the known galaxy. Not just Saurian networks, everyone was watching it. Humans, Velians, Korthans, even the reclusive Zenith Collective had picked it up. The view count was in the billions and climbing. Katie sat on her bed, hands shaking, waiting for Imperial guards to break down her door. This was it. She'd be executed for witnessing royal weakness. For daring to touch a prince. For spreading state secrets across the galaxy. But the guards never came. Instead, something else happened. Something nobody could have predicted. The messages started flooding in. Not to Katie, to the Imperial channels. Young Saurians. Battle-hardened veterans. High-ranking military officials. Even members of the Imperial court. All of them confessing to the same thing. The void syndrome. The ache they'd been told was weakness. The longing for something they couldn't name. The late-night tears they'd hidden from everyone. The desperate need for comfort that had been beaten out of them since hatching. I thought I was broken, one message read. I've served the Empire for 40 cycles, commanded 3 fleets, conquered 6 systems. But every night I feel this emptiness. Now I know I'm not alone. Another, I'm a protocol instructor at the Imperial Academy. For 20 years, I've been teaching hatchlings to suppress their emotions. I've been part of the problem. I want to fix it. The Imperial Mental Health Network crashed within hours. Too many Saurians calling in, asking for help, demanding answers. The physicians who'd been prescribing medication for void syndrome suddenly faced angry crowds wanting to know why they'd been told this was a flaw instead of a fundamental need. The Empire's entire psychological infrastructure collapsed under the weight of collective realization. 3 days later, Emperor Drakvan himself arrived at Nexus Station. Katie watched through the diner's viewport as the war fleet emerged from hyperspace. Massive dreadnoughts that could level planets. Cruisers bristling with enough firepower to crack moons. Fighter craft swarming like angry insects. The entire fleet positioned itself around the station. A show of force that made every ship in the area flee immediately. Katie stood behind the counter, wiping the same spot over and over, trying to keep her hands from shaking. This was it. The Emperor had come personally to deal with her. The diner doors hissed open. Emperor Drakvan entered alone. He was massive, even larger than Thalmor, his scales covered in scars from 1,000 battles. Some were claw marks. Others looked like plasma burns or blade cuts. His eyes were ancient and cold, the amber glow dimmed by centuries of violence. This was a being who'd personally conquered 40 star systems, who'd ruled through fear and absolute power for over 300 cycles. Katie had never been so terrified in her life. The Emperor walked to the corner booth, the same one where Thalmor had sat, and lowered himself into the seat. He looked at Katie with those ancient eyes. "Sit," he commanded. Katie's legs moved on autopilot. She slid into the booth across from him, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst. "Explain," Emperor Drakvan said, his voice like grinding stone. "Explain how humans raise their young." So Katie talked. She told him about mothers who stayed awake all night when their babies were sick, even when they were exhausted beyond reason. About fathers who taught their kids to ride bikes and pick them up when they fell. About bedtime stories and goodnight kisses and the way parents would drop everything if their child needed them. She talked about her own mom. How Diane Brooks would sit with her during thunderstorms because Katie was scared of lightning. How she'd made chicken soup from scratch when Katie had the flu. How she'd held Katie's hand during the scary moments and celebrated every small victory. "Human strength doesn't come from isolation," Katie said, her voice growing steadier as she spoke. "It comes from connection. From knowing someone has your back. From emotional bonds that make you want to be better, do better, protect what you love. We're not strong despite our feelings, we're strong because of them." The Emperor sat in silence. His expression never changed, but Katie noticed his claws flexing against the table, slow, rhythmic movements that she recognized now as distress patterns. When she finished, he stared at her for a long moment. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "I have ruled for 347 cycles. I have conquered more worlds than any emperor before me. I am called Drakvan the Unconquered, Drakvan the Merciless, Drakvan the Eternal." He paused. "But I have never once been called father. And I realize now that I have spent 3 centuries creating an empire of broken children." Katie saw something she never expected to see. A single tear rolled down the ancient emperor's scarred face. "We have been wrong," he said. The decree went out within hours, broadcast across every imperial channel. The creche system was abolished immediately. All hatchlings currently in isolation would be returned to their birth parents. Future generations would be raised with families, with love, with the emotional bonds they'd been denied for generations. Human psychological experts would be hired to help rebuild Saurian emotional culture from the ground up. Therapists, family counselors, childhood development specialists. The Empire was asking humanity for help, something that would have been unthinkable a week ago. Anne Katie Brooks, 26-year-old waitress from Earth, was appointed as the first ambassador of compassion, a position created specifically for her. She'd serve as a bridge between human and Saurian cultures, helping guide the Empire through the most massive cultural shift in its history. Thalmor came to see her one final time before departing with his father. He entered the diner quietly without guards this time. He looked different, his scales were brighter, more vibrant. The gray distress coloring was gone, replaced by deep, healthy crimson. He knelt before her, right there in the middle of the diner, an emperor's son bowing to a human. "Thank you," he said simply, "for seeing me when I was invisible. For caring when no one else ever had." Katie pulled something from her apron pocket, her mother's old recipe book. The cover was stained and worn, the pages dog-eared from decades of use. Diane's handwriting filled the margins with notes and adjustments. "My mom gave this to me before she died," Katie said, pressing it into his claws. She said the recipes weren't important. It was the act of making something with love that mattered. She looked up at him, her eyes bright with tears. Family isn't just who you're born to, Thalmor. It's who shows up when you need them. You showed up here broken and hurting. I showed up for you. That makes us family in a way. Thalmor's eyes shimmered. He held the book against his chest like it was the most precious thing in the universe. As the Saurian fleet departed, Katie stood at the viewport and watched them go. The massive ships that had terrified her days ago now seemed different somehow. Less threatening. More like the beginning of something hopeful. She returned to her diner and got back to work. But things were different now. Beings came from across the galaxy, not for the food but because they'd heard the story. They'd seen the footage. They wanted to meet the human who'd changed an empire with nothing but compassion. And Katie welcomed them all, one cup of coffee at a time, proving that sometimes the strongest warriors just need someone who cares. And sometimes all it takes is one human with a kind heart to change everything.